in the last lecture, we discussed, I would say, introduction to the polymer physics course. We talked about why exactly, what exactly are polymers. We talked about the fact that polymers have many conformations which give rise to molecular flexibility, and I gave some motivation towards like studying the physics of polymers. Okay, so in this class I will build on that and cover some more topics. So first I will discuss very briefly like how are polymers made. I already told you in the last class that this is not a polymer chemistry course, so we are really very brief here. And then finally I will elaborate on like why study polymer physics and what really it entails and so on. Okay, so first, how exactly are polymers made? Okay, so you will of course read in detail in a course on polymer chemistry, but I am really being very brief here. So as I already told you, a polymer chain contains a repeating unit, and then we have like a sequence of repeating units. And this is the n is the number of repeating units. Okay, I told you that all polymers are macromolecules, but all macromolecules are not polymers. What it really means is that if we do not have a repeating sequence, we do not typically call that a polymer. For example, a protein has like a unique sequence of amino acids, but it is like a non-repeating sequence. So in that case we do not call it a polymer. So when we talk about polymers in this particular way, and the polymers typically have to be formed by some kind of a monomer, which in the case of polyethylene that I just draw here, the monomer in that case is the ethylene molecule. Okay, so this is a monomer, and the reaction by and large is something of this particular sort. Okay, so you combine n monomers. As you can see, the monomer had a double bond. The polymer has all single bonds because the carbon at the ends form a new bond with another carbon. So one bond of the double bond went to another single bond with a different carbon and so on. So we replaced the double bond with a single bond here, and so this is my polymer. Okay, so very often people use the word monomer and repeating units interchangeably, but keep in mind is that when we say like a monomer, this is what we use to make a polymer, and when I will say a repeating unit, this is how it appears within the polymer chain. Okay, so there are two major ways to make a polymer. One of them is by addition polymerization, which goes like something like this: A plus AN becomes AN plus 1. Okay, so starting from say a monomer A, I will make something like A2. So 2 ethylene will come together, form like a butane type of molecule. Then that will come together with another ethylene, form like a hexane type of molecule, and so on and so forth. So the chain will continue to build as the polymerization is taking place. And then we have something called a condensation polymerization, where what I have is something like polymer chains, or I would say small polymer chains which combine together or condense together and form a larger chain. So, in the first case we always require a monomer to react. So, a monomer reacts with a growing chain and forms like a bigger chain. In the condensation case, the two chains are already grown, they react and form like a larger chain. Okay. So, in both these cases, what you can imagine, and I am looking at the physics aspect of things, is in the very beginning you have like monomers in the system, whatever the beaker or the reactor that you have. So, you have like a small monomers. So, they look like something of this sort, possibly they are like small monomers I have in the system, and then they do react, there is a polymerization taking place and we form a polymer. And now you can see when the polymer is being formed by either the addition mechanism or by condensation mechanism, it is not happening only at a single place in the beaker, it is happening at many places. For example, these two guys are coming together, but these two guys are also coming together, and maybe like 3 of them are coming together and so on, right. So, what you will see in the system is you start to form many different polymer chains, right. So, you can have these two guys will come together, form a polymer, then these two guys will also come together, form a polymer, and some will remain. And now both these chains will grow in the case of addition polymerization by combining with another monomers in the system, or they can for example come together and form like a larger chain, right. But by and large, the key point I want to mention here is that if you have say a beaker or a reactor, in that particular case you do not really have just one polymer chain being formed, because you start with say a gas of monomers or a liquid of monomers and the polymerization has ensued. When we talk about a liquid, it typically contains like moles of like monomers and species. So, moles means 10 to the power 23 of the order of 20 of those number of molecules. So, they are coming together. So, you may have like at any given time a very large number 10 to the power 20 or 15 polymers who started getting formed, and then this slowly grows. So, at any given time we do not really have one polymer chain, but we have many of polymer chains. And also, as you can already see that it is very difficult to control such a reaction. For example, some of the polymer chains may be more fortunate and they can get like more larger because they can find another monomers on the way. On the other hand, like some polymer chains can be less lucky, they will find like less monomers around them and then they will grow lesser, right. So, at the very end what you will have is actually a combination of polymer chains, some of them larger, some of them smaller, and it is very difficult to have a constant molecular weight or a constant value of this n. Okay. So, whenever a polymer is being sold or you buy from a market, it never has say n equal to 100 or 200, it does not have, or the corresponding molecular weight. What it has is a molecular weight in a given range. So, for example, n can be 100 to 500, or for example 1000 to 5000, or for example 10,000 to 50,000, or any other range, right. The key point here is that whenever we try to control or do this polymerization process, we never have a precise control on the molecular weight or the number of repeating units. Okay. So, what you end up having in terms of say if I refer to some sort of value like capital N that tells me the number of repeating units and I can use the same kind of a language for molecular weight as well. And if I plot a probability distribution of that now, that means that if I am looking at a polymerization reaction that produces polymers in the range of 100 to 500, you will have certain values of n which are more probable and certain less probable. So, in most cases you will have a distribution that looks like a Gaussian distribution. So, you will have some sort of an average molecular weight or n. So, I am using n for two things. I mostly refer to n as the number of repeating units, but it can also refer to the molecular weight. And the key idea is that when n is larger, the polymer becomes larger. And then the width of this distribution is what we refer to as polydispersity. Okay. So, and that is where the challenge is, right. So, as a polymer chemist, you want to first form like polymers of any molecular weight, because as you can expect, as I change the molecular weight or as I change the n, I am having different properties. The smaller n will have properties different from the higher n values. I also want to have some sort of a control on polydispersity, because if someone wants n equal to 1000, he may be happy buying something that is like 980 or 1020, but he may not be happy buying something that is like 20 or 50, right. So, if it is like more polydispersed, it is not really a very successful polymerization process. It can vary with the application, but the challenge for polymer chemist is to first make polymers of any average molecular weight and then to reduce the amount of polydispersity in the sample. Okay. So, there are couple of ways we can define the average molecular weight and polydispersity. I will, in the next slide, I will talk about the most common measures. Okay. So, talk about the ways to define average molecular weight. Okay. So, there is something called a number averaged molecular weight. Which is defined as something like this. Where Ni is the number of chains with molecular weight Mi. Okay. Then there is something called a weight averaged molecular weight. MW, that is defined as something like Ni Mi square by Ni Mi, where sum is over all values of I. Okay. And using these two, we can define what is known as polydispersity as something like a ratio of the weight average molecular weight and the number average molecular weight. And I want to establish that this quantity, typically referred as PDE, is equal to 1 when it is monodispersed. That is like, I would say, what everyone aspires to be but never gets there, that is when there is only chains of a prescribed molecular weight, there is no range, all the chains have the same molecular weight. But the quantity PD, how far it is from 1 tells me how much polydispersed it is. The higher it is, the more polydispersed the thing is. Okay. So, higher polydispersity means higher value of the PD corresponds to more polydispersed system. Okay. There is a very easy way to think of, or very easy example to demonstrate what really these two averages mean. Okay. And the example is the following. So, think of a system that contains thousands ants of say weight 1 gram. Okay, I am doing an example. We think about like 1000 ants of a weight 1 gram, and we have one elephant of weight, an elephant will be around 1000 kg. So, let us keep it around 10 to the power 6 gram. Okay. Now, if I compute the number average molecular weight Mn, what is it going to be? So, we multiply the number of species of a molecular weight with the molecular weight. So, in this case we have 1000 ants of weight 1, and I multiply this with, I add one elephant of weight 10 to the power 6th, and then I add up the number of ants and the number of elephants, and you can see this quantity will be something around 1000. Okay. On the other hand, if I find an MW, what is it going to be? So, in this case now it is 1000 multiplied by 1 squared plus 1 multiplied by 10 to the power 6 squared by 12, and then we have 1000 into 1 plus 1 into 10 to the power 6, and now we will get something like 10 to the power 6, right. A few things to note here. First of all, if I look at the number average molecular weight, it tells me it is around 1 kg. Okay. Just by looking at this number, you will not be able to guess that there is an elephant in the sample, because the number average is around 1 kg. So, every species more or less will have a weight of the order of 1 kg, right. It by no means estimates the weight of any species in the system, because the ants are much lighter and the elephant is much heavier. On the other hand, if I look at an MW, it is close to the weight of the elephant, at least it gets the heavier one right, it does a mistake in like the lighter one, right. But the key point here is, in this particular case MW by Mn, that is the PD, is around 10 to the power 3, the system is polydispersed, which it clearly is, because we have 1000 ants and one elephant. The elephant has much larger molecular weight than compared to the ant. Okay. So, now you start thinking of, instead of an elephant, if I place something like a cat which has like a much lower weight, then of course the MW will fall down, of course the PD will fall down, just because the weight difference between the species becomes smaller. If I replace say elephants with, for example, a bee which even has like a weight comparable to the ant, in that case the polydispersity will be closer to 1. Okay. So, the key point is the polydispersity becomes closer to 1 when all the species start having weights within a small range. Okay. So, this was about the ways to define the average molecular weight and polydispersity. So, next I will discuss about the types and classifications of polymers. So, we will discuss about the types or classification of polymers. Okay. So, we can classify the polymers in a variety of ways. One of the first ways that we can think of classifying polymers is how they originated. So, it can be by the origin of the polymer. So, it can be, for example, a natural polymer, and the example for example is cellulose, which you find in say trees or cotton. And then we have synthetic polymers that we really make in a laboratory or in an industry, really from sources which are not natural typically. For example, polyethylene, and we already told you like what polyethylene is. So, then there is one more classification, and that is by structure. Okay. So, I already told you about this, that I will represent the polymers by like a line, because there are many carbons. So, in all the examples that we have done, our polymer looked something like this. Okay. This is what we call a linear polymer. It really corresponds to a fact that there is only one main chain of carbon, there are no branches to it, right. But in reality there can be like possibility of a branching, where you can have a main chain and then a side chain. Okay. So, this contains carbons and these also contains carbons. Okay. So, there are two different chains connected together forming like a branch. You can have more fancy structures like what is known as a star polymer, which really looks like a star. It can be and this is the excellence of polymer chemistry over many years, that we can really make these kind of structures. They are not really a theorist's dream that this is how we can possibly make, but we can really make these kind of polymers in the lab. So, hyper branched polymers will have branches within branches. Then we can have something known as a comb polymer, and just the names, as the name suggests, it's like a comb. It's like a branched, but it looks more like a comb. So, you have branches on both the sides of the polymer chain. Okay. So, let me give you some more examples. I would say more fancy examples. There is something called a dendrimer that has been catching attention in recent years for applications in drug delivery and so on. And to do a dendrimer, you have to do something like this. So, you start from any point and you make certain number of branches. So, let us say you make 3 branches. Now, from each of these 3, you will again start around 2 new branches, and then from each of these new ends you again start two new branches. Okay. So, and this can continue for like long, right. So, as you can see, the first central one have like 3 branches, and after that each of them will have 2 branches, and depending on like how many steps I carry, I will have dendrimers of different generations, right. Depending on like how many steps I continue this process, I will have different kinds of dendrimer. This is a very fancy system, and I will talk about like some applications of similar systems. Then we have something known as a polymer network. I already told you about the rubber band. This is a cross-linked polymer. Okay. So, what it really composed of is like we have like polymer chains, which are, so these ones are polymer chains and they are cross linked at these points. There is some kind of either a covalent linkage or a physical linkage that really combines them together, so they form like a very nice network. Okay. If you want to think of like an example of a network, then of course rubber is one of them that we see in the rubber band, but there are other examples and more useful ones. For example, the diapers the baby wears, which can take up plenty of waters, they are typically composed of polymer networks. Just because we form this kind of a network, what it enables is to contain lot of water inside those systems, and for this reason they are used in diapers and other applications. Okay. Then we have other ways of classification, for example by composition. So, for example, we can have what is known as a homopolymer that will contain only one type of repeat units, A's, and all that. So, actually all the things that we have described so far were like homopolymer, CS2, CS2, CS2 and so on. But in reality you can also have what is known as a copolymer that contains two kinds of repeat units. Okay, so this is one repeat unit, but you can have two repeat units, and there can be many possible ways this can happen. It can be, for example, an alternating copolymer, that is like AB, AB, ABs and so on. It can be, for example, what is known as a block copolymer. So now you have like certain number of A's follows by certain number of B's, again like certain number of A's and so on. And then we can have what is known as a random or statistical copolymer, which is like there is no particular order. So, there is not like a alternating one or not like a block one. It can be, for example, 2, 3 A's, then 1 B, then maybe 2 A's, then maybe 4 B's. There is no particular order in how they are arranged together. It's really like statistical. It is not really following any kind of a rule. Okay. So, then there are other types of copolymer like what is called a graft copolymer, that is like you have the main chain of A's and then you have side chains of B's and so on. Okay. Just like we have a copolymer, we can also think of a terpolymer which will have 3 repeat units. Okay. So, finally, I looked at the classification by origin, classification by structure, and then classification by composition, and then there is a last one where we look at the classification by phase. So, it can be, for example, a polymer can be a solution. So, in this case the chemistry remains same, it depends on like in what phase the polymer is present, right. It can be present as a solution, it can be present as a blend, it can be present as a crystal, it can be like a gel, and it can be like a melt, and we will discuss like what exactly do these mean and what implications do they have on the polymer behavior. Okay. So, with this I want to conclude. So, in this lecture we discussed about the ways to make a polymer chain. We talked about two methods to make polymer chains: addition polymerization and condensation polymerization. Then we looked at how to characterize the average molecular weight and polydispersities of polymer chains. And then finally we discussed the types and classifications of polymers. And in the next lecture I will start introducing like what are the universal aspects that give rise to the polymer physics, and what exactly we learn when we do the physics of these polymers. So, I want to conclude here. Thank you.